Not really. I feel that a lot of pressure on the front line and really tough to move up. It's been probably a year since it's got really tough, and front line pretty much set up. It's been much different from the start of war. We don't get to. It was kind of easier at the start. Now it's tougher. It's heavier.
Welcome, and do tell us more about your conversation with the Estonian leader.
Yes, I was in Tallinn last week to interview Kaja Kallas, the Estonian Prime Minister, and the thing I was most interested to hear from her is her view on this debate that is going on more widely in NATO now about what happens if after a conflict, after the conflict in Ukraine comes to some sort of ceasefire or temporary solution or a frozen status quo, Russia then reconstitutes its forces in the Western Military District next to NATO's eastern flank, and then can either restore the strength that it had before on our borders or even better it. And her view was that this is likely to be between 3 and 5 years if you look at the mobilization machine that the Putin regime has put in place so far, and also at the rate at which its military industrial complex is regenerating things like 155 shells and armored vehicles.
Do you sense or feel or see that among the Eastern European NATO leaders, faith in their European partners may be faltering?
That is not something that someone like Kaja Kallas or any other prime minister from one of the frontier states would say openly, but it is absolutely something that you hear in off-the-record conversations with officials from the eastern half of NATO. There are deep concerns not only about whether the US would necessarily come to the defense of NATO's eastern flank under a President Trump, but even whether certain Western European countries would honor their commitments, or whether in a situation where there was an attack on a NATO ally, they might be inclined to interpret the Article 5 Mutual Defense Clause, which is, after all, a political instrument. It's not a red button that you press and then suddenly we go to war, in a way that is as generous towards Russia as possible.
Well, there is then a big NATO exercise plan for NATO's eastern flank. Is that reassuring to leaders like the leader of Estonia?
It's reassuring to the extent that there are 31 countries in NATO, and getting them all to work together is extremely difficult. I've seen for myself in the field in the Baltic states how when you have a force composed of 11 or 12 different countries, getting their radios to talk to each other, getting the shells to work between the different howitzers, just working through the language thing. And sometimes they're talking through, kind of the Google Translate app. Getting all of those niggles ironed out is absolutely essential to deterring Russia and making it believe that NATO can credibly mount a defense of the eastern flank. But on the other hand, I wouldn't necessarily overestimate the extent to which exercises like this in themselves are a deterrent.
I see. Right. Now, we know that among NATO's European leaders, there is concern about the possibility of America disengaging from NATO and from the defense of Ukraine. That being so, what is being said and done about that?
Well, the phrase rabbit in the headlights comes to mind because, frankly, if Trump were to weaken Article 5, he doesn't have to pull America out of NATO, which would actually be quite difficult as I understand it. All he has to say is that the US might not come to Europe's defense in this scenario. Then it would be the Brits, the French, the Germans, the really big military forces within European NATO who would be there. And as far as I can see, there is very little public discussion going on of this on a political level. And there's no obvious sign that contingency plans are being drawn up to fill this enormous vacuum that America would leave in Europe's defences.
It seems to be a hole in the conversation and in plans, which, as you say, are mostly not being drawn up. What about the state of public opinion, Oliver, there in Germany, and as far as you can see across Europe, on this question of backing away from the commitment to Ukraine?
Generally, the polls in Germany have been pretty stable, showing that there is, if not a majority, then certainly a plurality of the German public that wants Germany to sustain its military support for Ukraine. And it has done that quite recently. It's just announced another 8 billion euros worth of assistance to Ukraine. So there's no shortage of political will to keep going. The question is whether there is the amount of political will that you would need to step up and take America's place if
Yeah.
America fell out of the game.
And there was in Berlin questions about the commitment of the German government there, wasn't there? Some differences of opinion, within the political ruling order in Germany. How do you read that now?
The German government is generally very much united on this line that it will keep supporting Ukraine for as long as it takes. What it is divided on is what for. The German defense minister, one of the more hawkish members of Olaf Scholz's cabinet, has quite openly said that he agrees with President Zelensky and with the Poles and the leaders of the Baltic states that the objective here should be for Ukraine to reclaim every inch of territory that has been occupied by Russian forces. However, there is also a very studious and constructive ambiguity being drawn by other parts of the German government, most notably the Chancellery, over what the wider objectives are, which has led to a lot of rumour mongering that there is some kind of machinations going on in the background to try and make the Ukrainians come to the realization that this is not a war that they can win. As far as I'm aware, that is not a deliberate strategy yet, but certainly there has been a decision to hold back on certain kinds of support for Ukraine, most significantly the long-range Taurus missile, which would give Ukraine a kind of deep strike capability, very similar to what it gets with the British Storm Shadow.
Right. Oliver, Moody, really interesting. Thank you for joining us and sharing us those thoughts. Now, I want to cross over to Kharkiv in Ukraine and say hello and welcome to Alexandra Matvichuk, who's a soldier in Ukrainian Special Forces based there in Kharkiv. Hello to you, Alexander.
Hello.
So can you give us, if you would, your take on the state of the war now? Do you feel you are making progress?
Not really. Not really. I feel that a lot of pressure on the front line and really tough to move up. It's been probably a year since it's got really tough, and front line pretty much set up. It's been much different from the start of war. We don't get to. It was kind of easier at the start. Now it's tougher. It's heavier.
And when you say it's heavier, what do you mean by that, Alexandra? Do you mean the Russian enemy is stronger?
No, the weapons that they're using against us is heavier. It's simply real tough to even get to the first line. Just to even change people on the front line so they can take a break. Even that walk is tough, because you don't get to see now much of an enemy because of drones and artillery and tanks. So you don't get to use even your gun because just so much drones in the air all the time.
Right.
Ours, theirs, and all the time working artillery, all the time. It's never quiet. Maybe at night a little bit quieter because night drones is, I guess, tougher to get.
Right. So, Alexandra, tell me, as a Special Forces soldier, what kind of operations are you carrying out?
One is we do many things. but one is our special things that we help army to settle front lines, to check front lines, to make sure we have people in a position, on the right position, and we have to let know up there to our commanders if it's well or not. Sometimes we get in a battle in the middle of let's say different. When we start walking, we have one plan, but sometimes we get in battle with our boys.
Okay, clearly,
now we almost it's to go into recon. It's almost impossible. Maybe by the Dnipro River, it's you can find a ways to go through lines, but from Kharkiv to Zaporizhia, is all gray zone is impossible to cross.
okay.
Even to get to our first line is tough.
All right, we can, just from what you're saying, we can imagine how hard, I guess, it must be. Alexandra, thank you so much for talking to us this afternoon. That is